So what's the biggest criticism of training for hypertrophy or aesthetics? Probably that it's not functional or that it doesn't make you as strong or athletic as you look, right? Now, obviously, a lot of that is nonsense. Most of the people who do the functional thing are just, do you even lift morons LARPing? And people who focus on training for hypertrophy do actually get strong. They're just not practicing getting as good at expressing it in terms of one rep maxes on the big three, right? However, there is still some truth to that criticism, right? Training properly for hypertrophy, at least past the beginner or early intermediate stage, does get pretty involved and it can easily eat up all of a regular person's available training time, leaving not much left over for the other stuff, right? Now, if you have unlimited time to train, meaning you can train every day, sometimes twice a day, then you can start to combine some very effective hypertrophy training with the effective strength training, mobility, cardio, sport specific training, all sorts of skill acquisition. You can do all that, right? Even there, I would assume there are probably still limitations and trade offs in terms of recovery. But honestly, I'm not a professional athlete, and you probably aren't either. So for the rest of us, even serious lifters who can train like 6 days a week, doing it all simultaneously probably is not realistic, right? But does that mean that we have to pick between looking the way that we actually want to look, jack, tan, big arms or whatever, and on the other hand, being someone who does all the athletic stuff or has big lips or, whatever the case may be, but is constantly whining on Instagram about, physique inflation and coping about how whatever it is that they're good at is actually more important than looking a certain way? No, of course not. You can train for a variety of modalities and then use steroids to build muscle without actually doing the effective hypertrophy training. No, I'm just kidding. That's not what I'm advocating for in this video, although honestly, it is what a ton of these hybrid athlete or train like an athlete guys who kind of look the part are actually doing. They're not actually training in a way that would make them that jacked. They're just kind of doing the other stuff. And then, well, not all of them, though. Like, for example, Alec Blennis, I believe he's natural and he does crazy stuff, hybrid athlete and all that. But I do think a lot of these guys are kind of just because there's one thing that you can just inject. Like you can't inject anything and become a marathon runner, right? But you can kind of just inject something and get jacked. At least if you're doing a little something, right? But anyway, no, that's not what I'm advocating for here. No, natural lifters can kind of have it all to a certain extent. I mean, personally, I'm currently the most flexible that I've ever been in my life, except maybe when I was a toddler or something. I don't really remember being a toddler all that well. I certainly don't remember, what my standing pancake was at that time. I'm also the leanest I've ever been, most jacked. I mean, strength is always kind of a matter of what are you practicing right now, but I'd say overall yes. So anyway, it works. I definitely sympathize with wanting to prioritize your performance and not just focus on aesthetics. But if you can't get the looks with it, I'm kind of inclined to say skill issue there, as the Zoomers say. And now not everyone can be pretty, right? You may not look super aesthetic, right? But everyone can at least be jacked and lean but ugly, right? The prettiness is kind of up to your parents, but you can be jacked and lean and ugly, right? And also flexible and functional and all that good stuff, strong, right? So anyway, in my opinion, the best way to do that for someone who's interested in mixing hypertrophy with other qualities is to periodize our training by taking advantage of a cut, treating it kind of as an off season from hypertrophy training. I think Basement's called it that. And using that time when we're not getting the calories that we need to drive hypertrophy, to focus on modalities that aren't dependent on calories. That's what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to get into exactly how to do this in just a bit. Stay tuned. But first off, if this is such a good idea, why isn't everybody already doing it, right? Why is the advice that we normally hear train the same way on a cut as you would on a bulk? So I'm assuming it's going to be mostly the influence of competitive bodybuilding. So if you're natural competing in bodybuilding, you're going to have to get down to basically near death levels of body fat so that people can see the striations in your glutes. I'm not really sure who it is that wants to see striations in glutes, but for whatever reason, sacrificing your health to see butt lines has become part of the game. So it means you have to cut down the levels of body fat where losing muscle is actually a concern. So in that case, you probably want to keep training for pretty much exclusively hypertrophy as much as possible, just so you don't end up looking scrawny on stage. A lot of them end up looking scrawny anyway, but we're trying to avoid that, right? And if you're enhanced, I mean, maybe you can actually grow into the show, which happens in some cases, or maybe you're fighting to hold on to muscle as you change drugs away from what you used when you were bulking. I'm not really sure how that works, but probably something along those lines, right? Point being, this stuff doesn't really apply to recreational natural hypertrophy enthusiasts. I guess I'm not talking about people who like natural hypertrophy's channel.
That if you took Jeff Cavalier and you plug him into a microwave, he would melt.
I mean, you can't make you can't make your channel name just a thing because then every time someone says it, like it's like they're talking about you. I just like you can be training for hypertrophy naturally, and that's not like trademarked. That's annoying. Just pick a regular name, man. Anyway, for those who don't cut below 10% body fat, muscle loss really is not a concern. Like period. As long as you keep training in some way, you're going to be fine. If you think you lost muscle on a cut and you didn't cut to single digit body fat or have cancer or something or go off cycle on a drug or something, you did not lose muscle. You were just fatter than you thought at the start and your bench press went down due to leverages. Okay. It's not muscle loss, right? Convincing your body that you need to add muscle to be adapted to your environment as a natural is hard. But once you've convinced your body, it stays convinced for a while. And it certainly does not start burning through muscle every time you get calories. That's what body fat is for. Body fat works like so much better as stored energy than muscle. It's crazy to think that the body wouldn't just go ahead and use the body fat, right? You would have to burn like 5 pounds of muscle to equate to the energy of 1 pound of stored fat. And even then, you'd probably need more to compensate for the inefficiency of using protein. If you can even, break down that much muscle at once, which I'm sure you can't, right? Your body burning muscle instead of fat just because you're in a calorie deficit would be about as retarded from like a design perspective as a car switching from burning gasoline to burning the oil and transmission fluid as soon as the gas tank gets half full. It does not make any sense again, until you get below 10% body fat, and now you just have exceedingly little fat left to lose. So yeah, then bad things start to happen because remember, some of that is essential body fat that you can't just use for energy, right? So what you actually have to burn for energy is less than 10% when you get to 10% body. Well, it always is, but you get what I'm saying. You have very little left, so now we have to start doing things. But before 10%, none of that happens. You're fine, right? So you can most definitely put hypertrophy, it's always a tongue twister, isn't it? Hypertrophy training on the back burner and emphasize other training modalities on your cut without really any risk of muscle loss. And even if you did somehow manage to lose muscle, you'll gain it back in a week as soon as you start eating again from muscle memory. So no big deal, right? So how do we do that? Well, that depends on what else you want to do apart from being jacked. You could focus on a particular sport, endurance goals, any type of training really other than hypertrophy, right? But the two that I'm going to emphasize here are mobility and strength. Because those dovetail so well with hypertrophy training, and also because I actually know something about them, so I'm kind of qualified to teach there. I could teach you how to run an ultra marathon or play pickleball, whatever that may be. I don't even know what pickleball is, so I'm not going to obviously talk about it. So first off, why are strength and mobility beneficial for hypertrophy? I'm probably going to have to convince a lot of you, right? I thought we were all against power building, right? Power building's bad, right? Well, it is, but strength and mobility certainly are not, right? So why do hypertrophy enthusiasts need to train mobility? Well, the number one reason is going to be joint health. If you haven't gotten to the point where your joints are a limiting factor in your ability to build muscle, you're probably not training as hard as you think, or maybe you're not as advanced as you think. Either that or you're built like a tank, and you should probably thank your parents for giving you amazing skeletal structure, right? But mobility plays a huge role in joint health. In a whole lot of cases, joint problems are the result of not being able to use the most efficient movement pattern possible for a given exercise, just because you can't get into that position. So you have to compensate in some way and perform the movement in a way that's more stressful. Now, I know that's not the only cause of joint pain. That's not the issue in every case. It'll come after me. Joint bros. Okay. But it is something that contributes in a lot of cases, right? And just being weak in a particular range that you could accidentally get into can definitely make you more vulnerable to injury. So it really makes sense for anybody interested in a long, healthy career of hypertrophy training to train some mobility to avoid some of that downtime, right? And it's also going to unlock new ranges and exercises that you can train with. So, for example, behind the neck press is a wonderful exercise that should be in every natural bodybuilder's toolbox. Maybe then we wouldn't hear so much about how hard it is to build 3D delts naturally, but many lifters can't perform the movement at all or can't do it without pain because of movement restrictions in the shoulders. And it can improve your range also in existing movements that you can already do as well. A lot of lifters, far more than would like to admit, can't really get the bar below their knees on a proper RDL without allowing the spine to round some to compensate. Now, obviously, I'm not against spinal flexion. You guys know that. But in this case, don't you think you'd get a little bit more out of it for the hamstrings if they could actually move more than a few inches without having to let something else take over? Yeah. And one other slept on benefit to mobility training for bodybuilders that I really haven't heard anyone mention is that it teaches you a lot about the actual bodybuilding techniques, what they're actually for, when they're required, how to use them effectively. Think about stuff like mind muscle connection, slow eccentrics, pause in the stretch, bodybuilding concepts like that. How do most people treat them? They kind of treat it like a religion. So they either believe in this and they do it ritualistically, or at least, their own best interpretation of how that ritual is supposed to be performed in the hope that the hypertrophy gods will be pleased and send them gains. Or they are non-believers. They don't believe that this stuff works, so they don't use it, right? But when you get into serious mobility training, they kind of stop being mysterious rituals and become like technologies with specific function. Like what is mind muscle connection? It's not just fueling the muscle for the sake of it in the hope of pleasing the hypertrophy gods. It's paying attention to a specific muscle to make sure that what we think is happening is actually happening, that it's getting the desired training effect. And like you're training a maximally lengthened muscles, that's the perfect place to experience and understand this, right? A lot of mobility exercises involve weights, but how far the weight moves through space or how many times it goes up is of no concern to the mobility training, right? How much the muscle that we're actually trying to stretch lengthens is what matters, even if that means that the weight that we're lifting actually doesn't move as far. So paying attention to the muscle in question is critical. So what do we need to be able to pay proper attention to that muscle? Time. So the slower we move into that stretch position, the more time we have to pay attention and ensure that we're stretching what we want to stretch and not let other areas compensate, which brings us to the slow eccentric. You don't get any bonus points for for doing a movement slower than you would need to, but often you will need to move fairly slowly to pay proper attention to all the components of technique. For example, on Jefferson curls, um, which have a lot of things to focus on all at once, the number one piece of feedback that I give to clients, well, number one, tied with keeping your legs straight, because that's a common issue. A lot of people don't even realize they're bending their legs. But tied with that, number one piece of advice is to slow the movement down. Often, that alone, just slowing the movement down, fixes a lot of other issues because slowing down gives people time to pay attention to everything that they know cognitively that they're supposed to be doing, but can't do all at once when they're moving too quickly. And obviously, if we're going to all the trouble of doing all that to get a deep hamstring stretch, you might as well spend some time there, right? Maybe even see if you can get a little bit deeper, get a better stretch. So pausing ritualistically, like it's just basically go down, spend an arbitrary amount of time in at the bottom of the movement, and then go up again, right? Hopefully the hypertrophy gods will see this ritual being conducted and be pleased, right? Okay, so the pause in mobility training, like it's functional. It's not a break in activity. You're actively trying to get deeper by flexing your antagonist, trying to relax further, right? You're purposely trying to accomplish something. So in the Jefferson curl example I gave, now I don't have people start out on this, but what I do at the end, at the bottom, I'm actively contracting my abs and my hip flexors to pull myself deeper. I do that in RDLs too. People wonder why I use such light weight. Well, I'm using the opposing muscles trying to pull my hamstrings more. You know, so you're actually trying to do something with that pause, and it takes some time to do that, and that's the pause that you're in, right? And once you've done all these bodybuilding techniques with understanding as a purposeful means to achieve a real objective and not just kind of a magic ritual that, studies say might help or maybe it doesn't or whatever, whatever you believe about the magic ritual. Anyway, once you start using them, functionally understanding what you're doing, you get better at using them and you also understand when they do and don't apply. Some exercises do require these techniques to get the desired stimulus, so we should use them, but others really don't benefit from them. You don't need them to get the benefit, and you should probably just try to lift as much weight as possible for as many reps as possible, just up the intensity, because focusing on all this stuff does detract in some way from intensity, right? So understanding when we do and don't need to use it, it helps you make the best decision to, weigh those trade-offs, right? So in that sense, mobility training makes you better directly at bodybuilding. This stuff definitely applies to bodybuilding exercises, right? So what about strength? Why is that a benefit? So the current consensus in natural bodybuilding community, it's kind of split on that, right? With some claiming that strength training is worthless for hypertrophy and it's a distraction and power building is the enemy. And again, I'm not a huge fan of power building, but strength is something that's very antithetical to hypertrophy, right? While others still value it, right? And I'm definitely in the latter category, right? Again, your maximum size potential is going to be limited by your joint's ability to sustain the required training for that, right? And heavy load is an excellent way to build joint and tendon strength. Both the lightweight in range movements and the heavy overload both build tendon strength, right? So let's use both of it. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to mean powerlifting, although it certainly could. And nothing wrong with powerlifting being used that way. It's good for it, right? It could also mean something like the explosive force from Olympic lifting or something similar. That's an excellent choice. Dynamic lifts are definitely going to build a lot of tendon strength and ability to handle load. You could even take it further and employ some heavy partials or unilateral lifts for even a heavier, like tendon strength overload. You could even do more specialized types of strength trainings, like I'm not an expert on this certainly, but I'm just saying you could, like the heavy arm wrestling assistance exercises that you see to build tendon strength in those areas if you want durability there. And I imagine if you had that kind of arm wrestle durability, that would be very conducive to building big arms, right? And arm wrestlers tend to have big arms as a rule, right? Um, Anyway, while not everybody agrees, I'm also a believer that if you can increase the maximum weight that you can use, for a 1 rep max, it's going to trickle down to the weight you can do reps with and thus help you put on size. That's controversial, but I'm certainly a believer, right? I think most of the old school silver era guys were on my side, so I'll take that as a win, as well as most of the current guys who I see as having exceptional physiques. Not everyone agrees with that, but it's common belief, right? And then sandwiched between strength and mobility, we have movement variability. Doing enough of any one thing and not enough of other stuff can hurt you eventually with almost any activity. I mean, we can get injured from typing on the damn keyboard if we do it long enough, right? It's called carpal tunnel syndrome. Typing on the keyboard can injure us if we do too much of that, not enough of another thing, right? And hypertrophy training obviously requires us to do a lot of repeating the same movements over and over and over again to make progress, right? So when we do get the opportunity to stop doing that because we're not bulking anymore, well, we should definitely take that opportunity and do something different, right? Pushing hard on something that you haven't been doing will have you feeling way better than even a deload and just doing less of the things you were already doing, right? Different movement is medicine, right? That sounds like a really hippie thing to say, but it's true. Like try some movement variability and you'll feel great. On that note, you can also try to learn new exercises, stuff that might take a while to get good at. So it might not be the best choice to throw on during a bulk, when you're kind of depending on this to actually put on muscle, you're, eating your calories, you want it to matter. Maybe not the best time to learn a new exercise that might not immediately stimulate growth, but something that could have value once you are experienced with it and can use it in that way. So, for example, 2 cuts ago, I started scaling into deficit handstand push-ups. I was kind of following the lead of Alex Leonidas, Kodiak Killa, or Soviak. Again, some guys who value the size plus strength approach. I saw them doing handstand push-ups, saw the Silver guys doing it, said, you know what, I ought to be able to do that too. And man, after 2 years of using them as a main movement during my bulks, my delts are pretty happy with me. So I'd say that was a success. And again, we're using the cut when it's not that serious as time to practice the new exercise, right? All right, so before we get on to anything else, I want to quickly plug my sponsor, Barbell Apparel. We're talking about mobility training here, and hopefully when I edit this, there's going to be a bunch of training footage of mobility training and jeans. Obviously, those are by Barbell Apparel, so that's kind of all you need is an advertisement, right? Anyway, they're still running their Independence Day sale, so make sure to take advantage of the buy two, get one free deal. All right, so how do we actually train for mobility and or strength on our cuts, right? Well, I mean, you could just pick one or the other, pick a mobility program or a strength program, just run it, right? I mean, you could totally do that. That'd be a great choice if you have really specific goals in either one of those directions. But if you're like me, you're probably going to want to do both at the same time.
I tell you what I do, man. Two chicks at the same time, man.
And that's what I do. It's what I have my clients do. And again, unless they have very specific goals and in one or the other area. And even then, often I'll still have them do this and it actually works great, right? So the most important thing to know when combining strength and mobility work is that mobility work is strength work. It's very demanding strength work, in fact, and it must be respected. Over time, intelligent, progressive mobility work can absolutely help to prevent injury, but in the short term, it can also contribute to injury if not done correctly. So when you're getting into a new exercise, a new range of motion, leave the bodybuilding train to failure mentality at the door. Take it very, very, very easy at first. The time will come to push the intensity eventually. Obviously, we can't just expect to do like gentle stretches forever and make progress, but you have to work up to it, right? So check your ego at the door. Definitely don't ego stretch. um, at least at first. Eventually, ego stretching is kind of fun. Semi recommend, not like completely recommend. Maybe maybe that's a bad term. Anyway, so the second implication of this, of the idea that mobility work is in fact strength work, is that you should not do heavy strength work after in-range mobility work for that region. At least not at first, at least not when you're first getting into that mobility training. Maybe at some point you may want to do some mobility warm up for a particular movement that requires that. Maybe uh, eventually, right? But not after you do this on your, not after you do the mobility exercise your first time, right? Would you max out on deadlifts after doing like a hard back day the day before? Probably not, right? But mobility work kind of flies under the radar in many cases. You may not see it as being serious because the weights involved are lighter. So like just doing an unweighted lumbar extension drill might seem kind of harmless, but that could definitely increase your risk of back injury if you deadlift right after. And that would be, in fact, a great way to get a back injury if you're not used to spinal extension. Everyone's afraid of loaded flexion, but extension can get you too, and with very little load. Now, again, in the long term, training lumbar extension is huge, incredible for decreasing your risk of back injury. I strongly recommend it. I guarantee I've avoided a bunch of back injuries since I started doing it long term. But in the short term, it can 100% increase your risk of injury if you do some extension that you're not quite tolerant to and then load the spine heavily thereafter, right? So we need to do it, but we need to do it in the safest manner possible, right? So what I recommend if you want to combine these two modalities and is to go ahead and get your heavy lifting done at the beginning of a workout and then do lighter mobility work for the affected areas afterwards in that same workout. That way you have the entire rest of the week to recover before you load those areas that you just stressed, that you just like A, stressed, and B, unlock new range in. So you definitely don't want to unlock some new range that you haven't been in before and then suddenly load it accidentally. Yikes, right? So you might be asking why not do your heavy lifting in one workout and then do your mobility work for the related areas in the next. Again, mobility work, strength work, so there's going to be interference. You'll probably be sore and tight in the days after your strength work, which will make getting to your true in range a little bit more difficult. Not necessarily dangerous, but it's going to be less productive than just going ahead and hitting strength work and then hitting your mobility work like while you're still warm before you cool down and stiffen up. That works really well, really good combination. I mean, you can hit like mobility PRs, that's the thing, after you just hit, heavy strength work, and that works perfectly fine. Um, uh, for example, I've been experimenting with Zercher deadlifts as a strength movement. That's kind of my heavy strength work. And then last week I did that, and then afterwards I hit a range PR in Jefferson curls. It may not seem like a PR because I'm only doing 225. But that's a huge PR actually because I haven't been able to get the plates to touch the floor. Um, with that little weight, I've needed 315 or like at least 300 previously. So touching the floor with that little weight actually is a huge PR for me. It's got a little bit of a different mentality, but like that's really big. So being able to do that after strength work just kind of shows that it's working really well. Um, anyway, how you split everything up is going to depend on what strength work you want to emphasize. So for example, if we are doing some sort of deadlift, you're probably going to want to go ahead and pair that with mobility work for the hamstrings, hips, and spine, since all are going to be involved in the deadlift. And if you hit one of those, like hip work will kind of the hip mobility stuff will kind of catch you because you don't necessarily see it as affecting the deadlift that much, but that can definitely set you up for something if you do a little bit of hip mobility right before heavy deadlifts. So yeah, you definitely want to do hamstrings, hip mobility, and spine after your heavy deadlift for the week, right? And they also tend to be mutually tied into one another. It's kind of hard to hit one without hitting the other in a lot of cases in your mobility work. Like so it just makes sense to train all that together, right? So I'll give you an example of what that might look like. So if you want to peak a specific deadlift variation, you could do only the deadlift portion of your favorite powerlifting program, whatever that is, and then just skip the accessories that they recommend, and then instead do some hip mobility exercises, some hamstring mobility exercises, some spinal flexion and extension, and call it a day. If you prefer something a little bit less structured than like an actual powerlifting program, you just rotate between some old lifts that you haven't trained in a while and kind of want to keep fresh on, and then maybe some new lifts that you want to get some experience on. Just see what might be worth prioritizing while going ahead and keeping the mobility work constant. And then once you find a lift that you really want to focus on for strength, you can focus on that more, right? Or you might want to do something more specific, some target tendon strength overloads or whatever. Instead of trying to PR on a specific lift, you can do that too. Just a cool example that's in my head. I haven't done this, I wish I could, but if you have a setup for it, you could do this. You could do overhead lockouts with exceedingly heavy weight. The old timers at York would go up to like 800 or 900 pounds on like overhead lockouts because they had a chain set up in their gym that you just hang a barbell on. So you're moving the top inch, building enormous tendon strength. You could do that if you have such a chain or a power rack that is conducive to that. And then after that, you could do some shoulder mobility exercises, right? Whatever you would like to work on or think you need to work on, right? Now, not all your work on the cut obviously has to be strength or mobility, right? Um, you could do plenty of regular old hypertrophy work too, especially if you're already plenty flexible in an area. Some people are just really flexible. You don't need to train that anymore. So why would you train something you're already good at, right? That's not necessary. Or maybe you're strong enough in a given area. Cool, just do whatever hypertrophy you want. And on that note, the cut is a fantastic time to experiment with new exercises that you think might work well for hypertrophy on your next bulk, but they maybe have a little bit of a learning curve, like the handstand push-ups that I mentioned earlier, right? I think a lot of experienced lifters don't try new things just because it would take too long to get good at them to the point where that'd actually be a useful stimulus. But again, your cut is the perfect time to do that since you don't actually need it to stimulate growth immediately. You just need to maintain, and that's easy, right? They say that newer lifters tend to program hop and try too many new things, but honestly, I think a lot of experienced lifters don't try enough new things because you're at the stage where you might need that new thing to get around the problem, unlock new growth. So I think experienced lifters who are in it for the long haul should actually have some time in their program that they devote to research and development, putting new tools in their toolbox, trying new things, and seeing what works. And again, the cut is the perfect time for that. All right. So what about when it's time to end the cut and start bulking again? Well, now we put the mobility and strength work back on the back burner and prioritize the work that's going to make best use of your surplus, which means your traditional hypertrophy training, right? We all know what that is. But again, it's easier to maintain this stuff once you've built it than it is to build it from scratch. So you should be able to at least keep a lot of it without as direct training, right? So as far as mobility, how to maintain mobility while doing hypertrophy, the best way to do that is to use exercises that pull double duty that are equally effective for hypertrophy and mobility, right? So some great examples here are pullovers of many types, sissy squats, if you can do them without bothering your knees. If you can, I recommend scaling with bands. RDLs are fantastic for this if you do them right and don't just make it a conventional with no touch. Um, Cross bench or GHD sit-ups, deficit push-ups, something on parallettes or whatever rings, maybe deep dips, deep range dips are fantastic. Jefferson curls, especially if you've spent enough time and progressed them to the point where you can actually start pushing the intensity on them. Definitely do not do that intensity stuff right off the bat. Please do not do that. But once you've progressed them to that point, they are fantastic, right? As far as maintaining strength, well, you should actually be gaining strength on your bulk in the real sense, but in terms of maintaining one rep max practice, my favorite strategy is just to use overwarms. So work up to a heavy single before your rep work. This keeps you current with the heavier weights while actually improving your performance on your rep work. So it's obviously not going to be as good for maintaining one rep maxes as a dedicated peaking program would be, but it's some pretty good low hanging fruit, pretty good best of both worlds, right? Okay, so now we've covered splitting your training into hypertrophy focused bulking training and then your off season calorie independent cutting training, right? So who should and shouldn't use this approach? Well, as we've already stated, it's probably not a good idea for actual competitive bodybuilders as they might actually lose muscle mass due to their just excessive unhealthy dieting, right? And it's also not a good idea for beginners, maybe even early intermediates, as these groups actually stand a good chance of building muscle while they're in a calorie deficit anyway, right? Plus, this approach would probably just confuse them anyway, right? So it's better to keep it simple for them, right? And I suppose that's why most of the fitness industry says keep your diet the same when you cut, right? But that's not my target audience, so I'm sharing the good stuff with you guys who are willing to go the extra mile to get better results. Ultimately, you kind of can have your cake and eat it too. You just have to work way harder, learn completely new styles of training, and get outside your comfort zone. If that sounds good to you, even though I didn't really sell it all that well, now that I think about it, I kind of actually made it sound hard. But anyway, if that does appeal to you nonetheless, despite my poor marketing, I do offer coaching. I can set you up with a plan that does exactly what I talked about here, so you can finish your cut not only with better abs, but also better movement, joints, and tools to maximize your results in the next bulk. And if you want to make cutting suck as little as possible, consider my ebook, The Anti-Fragile Diet, which covers fasting, food choice, and mental strategies with an eye toward making fat loss as easy to integrate into a busy life as possible. If you already bought it, go ahead and check your email. I just made an update on expanding the pros and cons of various multi-day fast frequencies. So that updated copy should have been sent out to you. So check your email there. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. And if you did, please make sure you click all the buttons and leave a comment so that the robots know you do, and we'll recommend videos to you and to other like minded individuals.